When Castlevania hit the Famicom in 1986, and then came over to the United States on the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1987, the game was an immediate hit. The game had players in control of a character by the name of Simon Belmont in the year 1691 as he faces off against Dracula. The game was hit with very positive reviews, but also became known for its extreme level of difficulty, similar to Konami's other hit series, Contra. In 1986, Vampire Killer also managed to be released, which was a member of the Castlevania series, but the game unfortunately was only released in Japan and never went stateside. Not too long afterward came the sequel to the original game, Castlevania II Simon's Quest, which was a much more non-linear game, similar to something you would see in a game like Metroid. After a quick arcade departure with the release of Haunted Castle, Konami decided to bring the Castlevania series to the handheld, and that is when players were introduced to Castlevania: The Adventure. Now, the first thing that struck out to me when I started up the game is the graphics are done very well for such an early Game Boy title, and it truly showed the potential of what the system would become. The music, on the other hand, starts off somewhat mediocre, with the ambiance or mood of the Castlevania series truly lacking, but it picks up about 3/4 of the way in, and by the final level the music really gets the blood pumping. Unlike previous Castlevania games, this one has no weapon power-ups of any kind, and instead leaves the player with just their basic whip to defend themselves. And although it can be upgraded to shoot fireballs, this power can be lost very easily, similar to the ability to shoot a ranged attack out of your sword in The Legend of Zelda, but only when you have full health. The game is filled with many difficult obstacles, which really make it difficult to progress, with there being constant threats from enemies, as well as difficult jumps and constant cliffs. You begin the game with a mere 3 lives, and are given no continues, so once all of those lives are up, the game is over. And trust me when I say it is incredibly difficult to find additional lives throughout the game. Another thing worth noting is that, with the exception of Dracula, none of the recognizable bosses are here from the series, but the ones that are here are still very difficult nonetheless. The one level that stands out in my mind as both creative but also the most difficult level in the game would be the 3rd level, where the entire level you are racing against the clock, trying to get through it as quickly as possible, while many obstacles keep pushing you forward, such as moving floors made of spikes and things like that. While this concept has been done with other games, it seems to be the best executed here, and it's done in an interesting way to keep things fresh. This game unfortunately seems very short, with only 4 levels in the game, but that is where the difficulty comes into play, which certainly increases the length of the game. This is something that is common in older games, where the difficulty is what is relied upon to give the game length. But even with all of my complaining, the gameplay is surprisingly fun as the player jumps across platforms and ropes while taking out countless enemies. Now that we've talked about the gameplay, let's break down the story. This game takes place in the year 1576, whereas the original Castlevania took place in 1691. You play as Christopher Belmont, who is a descendant of Simon Belmont from the original game, and your goal is to defeat Dracula, who seems to be out and about once again. The storyline is very basic and recycled, as this seems to be the plot of nearly every Castlevania game, but then again, Castlevania is much more about its atmosphere and gameplay rather than its plot. And then the only other scrap of story is that at the end, Dracula is defeated once again, and Christopher stands back and watches Dracula's castle crumble. But just as it all seems to be over, a bat flies out of the castle just as the game ends. This ending really seems to cheat the audience and defeat the purpose of the entire game, as everything comes full circle, with Dracula being around both the beginning and the end of the game, with the only change being that Dracula's castle is destroyed at the end. Also, I'm not sure as to whether this ending was supposed to hint at Dracula's return in the original game, seeing as this one takes place first, or if Konami pulled a George Lucas and was instead leading into Castlevania II Belmont's Revenge, which would be the next handheld installment in the series. Then again, Konami often tends to leave these sort of endings regardless, so who knows. Upon the game's release, it was generally considered a stripped-down version of the console games and had a large variety of reviews ranging from positive to negative, with most of the negative reviews focusing on the difficulty level of the game. But even with the mixed reviews, the game was successful enough to be included in the first volume of the Konami Game Boy collection in the late 1990s, where color was added in the European version of that collection. And then a remake was made for the WiiWare in 2009 titled Castlevania: The Adventure ReBirth. And as for my overall opinion on the original game, well, I have to say that if the difficulty was toned down a little bit and the length of the game was increased, this would certainly get a lot higher score. But I still managed to enjoy it for what it is, even if it does not manage to hold up as well as other Castlevania titles nowadays. So overall, I would have to give this game a 3 out of 4, and a recommendation to anyone who can handle its extreme level of difficulty.